Good evening. Today is 14th of March 2022. You welcome to the studio Think Imagine's first interview evening. Every semester we try to do such arrangements with Turkish colleagues or the colleagues who have international practice. And tonight we are hosting Rami Bebawi from Canva Architecture. You're welcome, Rami.
Thank you, Pina. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Yeah, for us also, it's a great pleasure to host you. Rami Bebawi is my friend from 2019 Amsterdam World Architecture Festival. We were judges there, and we did not lose connection. So as I asked him to give us a presentation, make an interview with us, he accepted it immediately, and I'm so thankful about this. So Rami, is it possible you share your screen and we start your presentation?
Yes. Do you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. The stage is yours. So use it, run it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be able to share with you. We'll make it a bit different. I think that the idea of simply presenting projects is not only what we wanted to do. We were talking, Pinar and I, about the importance or the value that Canva has with regards to storytelling. And so I'll start with the story of Canva. I think this can be, because it says a lot about who we were able to become afterwards. So I thank you for allowing me to share a story, and I'll start in a very personal manner. This is myself when I was young, and I wasn't exactly sure what I would do, and it wasn't necessarily towards architecture, and it was a youth of a lot of moving around. I'm actually born in New York, in Rochester, New York, and my parents moved a lot. And so all of my youth was spent in the north part of Canada, something called James Bay, for 5-6 years over there. We then ended up going down south more to Central America, in Nicaragua and Managua, and finally Montreal became home. I did not start in architecture. I started in microbiology. There was a passion for living beings. And so it was during those times that during an exchange to the south of France, I started re-questioning exactly what I wanted to do. And that questioning led me to the School of Architecture in McGill University, which at the time I think was an evidence to everybody except myself. My mother being an architect as well, I suppose was simply waiting for that to happen. This is Mary. She's the one that was at the counter, at the desk, taking care of all the students when I learned I was accepted. And she's been close and supportive the entire time. Certain things started appearing during school, the idea of collaborating with different disciplines. Already at the master's level, one of the first projects putting forward had to do with it, was published in an archaeology magazine, where we're trying to study the traces of a past site and transform them into an artwork to speak of the history. And I often come back to this because you realize 25 years later, we're still speaking of art and archaeology and traces and so forth. During my time of school, most of the years were spent with Tudor Radulescu, who is the co-founder of Canva with myself. And so we studied through the years, and after finishing school, I went into the construction industry. I actually managed from sweeping floors to taking care of the different trades and construction, this building for a couple of years, moved on to other buildings, and then attempted to have a practice, or at least to try and work in a firm for a few months, and realized that that wasn't the way to go. Meanwhile, Tudor was working in a practice which had to do with healthcare, very specialized. And on the side, we started doing competitions in the evenings and the weekends. This is one of them that was won at the Canadian Center of Architecture. And so we were both young with very little responsibilities. I was 29, he was 27. And so around 10 a.m. on August 15th, 2003, in the living room of my apartment, we created Canva. And that was how we started. And for 1 year, we worked from this apartment. And following that, the next year, we actually found another place in a building. It's one of the first concrete skyscrapers in Montreal, or at least high buildings. We renovated it ourselves, found ways to unload concrete and fix up the place, and started the practice from an office. And within a few years, we occupied another floor, another corner of the street, had bigger spaces, the team grew, and most recently, we're occupying a ground floor as well, where there's a certain communication with the city, the street, and the idea is to try and share and have different moments where there's an interaction with the street. That's how Canva started. It's a small 5 minutes just to share the genesis, but always when it comes back to what matters the most is the team. These individuals, Killian, Minjao, Olga, Tudor, of course, co-founder with myself, Eloise, Dina, Gabrielle, Miriam, Brigitte, myself, Haley, and Julien. Lulu is our dog. That team, its commitment, and all of the adventures that are shared together between social and work is the essence of perhaps the success or the journey of Canva. And I would tell you that COVID brought a new challenge of trying to link and to stay close together through these years from a distance. I think that over the years, what we understand about ourselves is perhaps 3 fundamental principles. The first one is the commitment of the team, commitment towards ourselves, and also towards the projects and the clients. The notion of storytelling, to always have a narrative to what's being put forward in a project, and this constant seek for technical innovation and understanding of true constructability and engineering of a project. This highly technical that's associated with the storytelling. And the values that come out of this when we speak of storytelling is that it allows to reveal stories. I think at the end of the day, what we're trying to say is that architecture doesn't always have to carry its own genuine story, but it can simply be a lens, or at least a way of engaging into a memory, revealing it, being sensitive to a site, and allowing that story to be expressed. And then architecture becomes a catalyst in terms of storytelling, and not an entity for itself, but an entity to reveal. The notion of sentient architecture often comes in terms of value. Sentient in the sense that to not simply dwell or rely on the site, to be able to have an architecture that also engages other senses, that can understand that perhaps the experience can have to do with an inclined floor, or a level of humidity or heat, or a brightness. And this sort of relationship to senses is also a way of bringing closer the relationship of human and nature, for it is what we share with other living species. And within this, we often turn towards something called the heart, the head, and the hand. And that is always to be able to have a project where there is an emotional attachment, the heart, where there is an intellect that's being brought to the table, the head, and perhaps promote change, or at least different ways of living and different values, which is the hand, the opposite of the footprint, but the handprint as you move forward. With this, we've had a practice, obviously, that's oscillated between art and architecture, permanent and ephemeral. The office has used actually the opportunities of different artworks to complement architecture, and architecture to complement art. And so at one point, if you remove the notion of time and scale, you start to wonder, where is that boundary? And by blurring that line, the explorations and experimental are extraordinarily complementary and educative between the different ways. And finally, there is growing more and more, as so many people, and particularly with the recent projects, this whole notion of balance between humans and nature. And beyond just the idea of sustainable design, we as architects become a social actor to put forward a different relationship with our environment, habitats, landscapes, and other species. So those are very important values that the team carries. The process is relatively straightforward. The dedication, the commitment we spoke of, public engagement, also to be able to be part and engage the public to be part of different projects, whether through dialogues, conferences, visits, or debates. The technical expertise we were speaking of, we have a practice which is quite particular. Canva has occupied at times the role of architects, designers, artists, but as well builders. And so this aspect of technology and construction is very close to us. And the use of prototypes. And the more that we're going towards experiences rather than nice images, the value of a prototype is fundamental to be able to bring something through with regards to clients, but also to understand ourselves. So that's a small brief introduction of Canva. And I'll take time to go through a few projects, some more in detail than others, and they can reveal different ways of doing. There's a great variety of projects that have been accomplished over the last 20 years, numerous awards and recognition, and they serve to maintain a certain confidence, because as everyone, there is always a certain doubt in what you do, and these help. And even though we've participated and succeeded, we've also failed many, many times and lost many competitions, but that is part of our practice. The first case study is called Irene. It's a particular project. It was actually in the part of the city that has an industrial heritage. It's the building that's highlighted right now. It's a two-story building from the 1928, I believe 1920s, 1930s, that was developed into a steel fabrication, a steel plant along the train station. And it has a very important corner because one of the street facades is on a very passing street called Saint-Jacques, and the other one is a very private residential street. Before doing any of the work, we gathered images of the old buildings and went to see a school next door and invited students to start doing graffitis and artwork throughout the building inspired by industrial heritage to promote a sort of sensitivity to your environment, your built environment. And as we were doing this, we were studying it. It's a very large footprint that could not be adapted to different residential multi-use. And so we wanted to open up a square, and we started putting idea that the building itself becomes a performance. And the performance at various levels, because the word performance can be about a wall performance, the sort of the building envelope performance, how that can perform. It can be in terms of sustainability, lasting, and durability. But there's also the idea that can the building participate in terms of an actor within the street and be a performance. And so what we did is, the idea was to repurpose, to resalvage the base, to insert a program within it. And so it became the secondary structure from within, and to wrap with a very contemporary envelope that's animated the upper part. And the idea was that this envelope can be moved, opened and closed by the public, by the occupants themselves. And it served as a sort of mesh, a metallic wall perforated to allow, in terms of a building performance, all exchanges of natural, whether it's sun, air, and any types of systems directly on the facade were not visible. It was excessively efficient in terms of MEP systems, because instead of having everybody going up all the way up to the roof, you have direct contact with the exterior through your own facade, which is the greatest control, quality of air, freshness, acoustics, and so forth. And so we designed different prototypes. The idea was not to create something completely novel. The idea of using a very high intelligence, low tech strategies. And so the construction, and if I come back to this prototyping, what's extraordinary is that we were also playing with the levels of perforation and trying to see what different screens can have different openings And how can I allow for complete privacy, yet the complete use of the sunlight? The construction was an adventure. We were actually responsible for the construction at the same time in this project. And you can see the final product, depending on the orientation, the day, and the climatic conditions, the screens are opened or closed. And you end up having a building that also is performing. There is a relationship to the heritage, which was metal, and that this metal upper level that adds to it speaks of what the industry was beforehand. And this is in a mezzanine, in a sort of covered balcony, giving on from a unit. It was amongst our first to allow Canva to be recognized. It was celebrated with, I believe it was an award of excellence at the Royal Architecture Institute of Canada for innovation in architecture. And it was a great stepping stone for us. We were also responsible for all the graphics, again, using architecture as a means to be an expression, the same story again, and how building can become a performance. That was Irene. Entre les Rangs is a complete other scale. This is about a public art intervention. It's in the middle of downtown Montreal. It was part actually of a competition called Luminothérapie. In the middle of winter, they're trying to bring some sort of light and this sort of installation that can bring people out. And so you understand that you need to be designing for winter. We're talking about light therapy, how can it help? And the starting point, as always, is the site. And I think what's interesting about this site is that it's actually a link between the mountain and the river. And it's a big wind corridor. And so the first thing we did is when we walked it and felt that wind, the idea was how can we profit from the wind as a form of energy that can generate some sort of animation in our site. Understanding the scale of the site was a challenge. At times it is filled with thousands of people during festivals. And to be able to understand that in the winter, the notion of designing for scale has to do that there's less and less people. And so by backing up, we realized that this rectangle was actually in its proportions and position between the river and the mountain in Montreal, similar to the subdivision of agricultural lots that were originally in the province in Quebec. And you see that this is how the territory was divided. And perhaps it was an opportunity to study these fields and imagine these fields, which are this notion of freedom, or at least within a certain collective memory, and bring that to the city. Entre les rangs means between the fields. And so this project salvaged bike reflectors, recycled plastic bases, to be able to create these prototypes and that were able to mount and demount excessively quickly, almost like a kit that can travel, and that put forward 28,000 rods. And they were all installed in one evening as a group of people together on the site. And they became this peaceful and soft canvas. And the canvas of the reflector actually is animated by the wind. And to this, there was a light performance that was added to it that follows the sunrise and sunset within a day. We collaborated with different artists and musicians to create within a string quartet the idea of tension as this waving stick is oscillating. And these speakers that were randomly hidden throughout the installation were linked to wind detectors. And so we come back to the wind. And so what would happen is that when the wind will be blowing excessively loud and strong, the sound starts traveling faster between the speakers, rises, and you end up having this sort of very multisensorial experience. I don't know if you see my screen here. I can show a small animation which could be of interest. So it was Entre les Rangs. And what's interesting that it has been since 2015 traveling around cities in the different world. This is in a cloister on the left that you can see. Actually, everybody's always fascinated about this because it's a cloister in the village, the city of Durham in the UK, where they actually filmed the Harry Potter movie. It was the cloister. And so the Entre les Rangs was there. And it became our first important public artwork. Edison Residence is another project which is very powerful in terms of storytelling. It links the story of a fire that burned the building in the 19th century, an art installation composed of beds, the invention of cinema, and the idea of photo engraving within concrete. And so there was an empty lot. It's in front of McGill University, actually. This lot had buildings at the turn of the century, and they had disappeared due to a fire. Being in front of a student community, the idea was, can the building itself start also becoming a laboratory? Can the building educate and participate in this sort of university neighborhood? And so it was to be a university student residence with 30 rooms. And the first idea was to resalvage, repurpose 30 used bed frames and to place them on the site. And so what happened is that the program is on the site without a building. And it became an art installation during the summer and allowing for people to discuss, to exchange, to debate about it. And in a world where almost privacy has almost isolated only to our bedrooms, how is it when a private object is put in the public realm? And how can it complement architecture? The idea was to put forward an architecture that talks. That is also, again, this notion of performance, but that's revealing different stories. And so how do you make a building talk? And this is a very typical non-linear way of thinking of Canva. We started the exploration by studying how photography became cinema. For cinema brought photography to life. And at the same time, we fell upon a movie by Thomas H. Edison, who in 1901, he was one of the inventors of cinema. In parallel, we were studying the notion of how can concrete talk? How can concrete speak? This principle, a firm called Reckli in the Recklinghausen in Germany, that uses, by distancing, opening grooves of different depth and different width in concrete, can attain almost 240, 250 different shadows or shades of green, of gray. And so we found, it's extraordinary, we actually found that this lot that we're studying, which is empty because of fire, well, in 1901, Thomas Edison, one of his first movies, filmed fire horses right next to our site, going to put out the fire. So we went to get that movie at the Washington Library and started to decompose the movie, the images, and started to imagine, can we create a building, a facade that tells the story of that fire and bringing the building to life? And so with this idea of having a very international technology, but to be able to put forward a very local narrative of why that site is empty. This is Tudor and myself in Germany at the time, testing the different molds that were in rubber, where the images are starting to appear. And so the building, the site plan is quite simple. It's a straight relationship directly in front of the university. The idea is to have a public volume, the public block that's on the street. The living spaces are at the back. There is a sort of side entrance that allows also giving access to a back garden. And then the facade expressions become the moving pictures, the photo engraving of that Edison movie on the front, and the student residence that have this yellow slit, which is a sort of tongue-in-cheek to the yellow tape that used to be used to hold together old movies. Again, the construction, technical innovation, because the wall is all prefabricated, all components within it. It had to go up excessively rapidly because it was on the street leading to a hospital, and a very highly performing building. And so what happens is that we end up having a building that tells a story. And it's extraordinary because depending on your position and the sun and the building, the image may appear or disappear. And so what was there 120 years ago is now part of the facade, telling the story of a fire, but also promoting the idea that a building can talk and speak and be part of the dialogue, and that the stories are revealed once again. The stories don't come from us. They belong to the site. We simply allowed them to express themselves. And it's in front of the engineering faculty, which is a great pleasure to me, as they're studying concrete, to have this example in front. This is an entrance lobby, which we call the cocoon. Public amenities from kitchens and bathrooms, and the rooms itself, where concrete is revealed throughout the building. I can perhaps show you. No. So that was the story of Edison. And it was a very complex project, very technical, but very powerful in terms of the different stories that it put forward. When we first spoke, Pinar and I, about giving a presentation, it was obviously there was a link to the Biodome. The Biodome is a very, very important project at Canva. There is a before and an after. There was a competition that was in 2014, and it took us 6 to 7 years to complete this project. It's within the old Olympic installations of 1976. The international competition was held by an entity called Space for Life, which has the Biodome, Insectarium, Planetarium, Botanical Gardens, and that always has this discussion of the relationship between humans and nature. And we come with the idea that we're at a critical moment. And this critical moment between destruction and sustainability, each are competing. And I think the question you ask yourself beyond attaining to be sustainability, but can architecture change behavior? And I think that that question is fundamental in our practice. And so the Biodome was a journey where we first needed to understand the existing building, Olympic heritage. This building, which was only holding on 4 points, an enormous span with natural skylights all above. We needed to understand the inhabitants. We're taught, or practice leads us to design for humans. And now this design is for other living species. It is a completely different way of understanding what surrounds us. And of course, something that needed to be done with a team. And this team was also from the Biodome. The original architecture, which was a velodrome in 1976, and then transformed in 1992. We needed to understand the users, how they go about, what they learn from this, and more importantly, perhaps all of the team at the Biodome. It is a project which amplifies the notion of collective achievement. It is impossible to take one decision alone. You need around the table, from technical to engineer to biologists, to experts in vegetation, experts in lighting, soils experts. It's a very, very technical and very collective as a project. David Suzuki, very important and major activist, environmentalist in Canada, putting forward the idea that perhaps environmentalism is simply a way of seeing things. And so us, again, trying to use the heart and the hand to be able to create this attachment, to be able to educate, because it is a science museum, and to be able to promote change. The formal strategy started with the fact that the building actually looked like a building nucleus in terms of a plan. And the original path, what people would enter, go around different ecosystems and leave. And so we wanted to break that up. And the first gesture was to open the core, to try to identify spaces that were actually opportunities. And as we opened that core, we started creating slits between different ecosystems and wrapping all of these ecosystems. And they were wrapped by this veil, this white skin, which we call the living skin. It's almost 0.5 kilometer in length. It structures the project, it anchors it, it's emblematic. It becomes a sort of membrane, an exchange when you make again the link to intracellular morphology, that it is a space of exchange. In our case, it's exchange of humans as they're going from different ecosystems. It has a capacity in its neutrality to contrast with the existing building, to promote it, to bring back its dignity. And at the same time, it serves as sort of a guide, and it accompanies people as they go through. These were first 3D models, 3D prints, where we're imagining this open entrance, this humongous hall, and there is an intuitive circulation. For the skin guides you and funnels you through moments of pressure and decompression. This is the entry hall. The original concrete structure is preserved, it's highlighted, it's salvaged. The skylights are revealed. This was all hidden. There was very low ceilings in this area. And you see the skin is translucent, and as the sky and as the sun moves across the building, the skin changes and then appears. And it's self-supportive, and it's a very, very technical challenge that it was to be able to adapt it to an existing structure. You see the middle being this open space above. And the idea is that when people enter, they're not funneled directly through an exhibition. It's as if the entrance becomes this sort of urban ecosystem where people arrive and tickets and so forth, and you need to funnel them down into a tunnel. And that tunnel actually has an inclined floor. If I come back to the slide 2 seconds, it funnels you to a tunnel where there's a floor that's slightly inclined that you cannot see with your eyes. You can't necessarily perceive it, but it slows you down. And again, we're coming to the notion of the sentient architecture. Can architecture make use of these tools also to alter or to influence an experience? And once you've gone through that, you arrive to this void in the middle of the building where there's nothing except looking up to the skies. And from then, people go through what we call an echo transit, which is a smaller slit. And it's very interesting because that slit, as you approach, there's glazed windows, doors that open, and you can't see what's inside because there's beads, sort of curtains to make sure other species don't escape. But you can hear, you can smell, you can feel the humidity, the temperature, the sound. And so what you're doing is that you're revealing an ecosystem by playing with the senses and allowing sight to always be at the end. This is what we call the echo transits. And these are smaller, narrower spaces before entering into this multi-sensorial world of the different ecosystems. I could speak hours and hours about the biodome, the different habitats, the different fish, the different rocks, the different plants, the different lights. Mimicking, recreating, understanding nature is a very humbling experience. At the top, we created a belvedere. For the first time, we're able to bring people to another level, higher. And in this higher part, they're closer to the skylights. And at the same time, there's more of a museology, more instruments, more interactive plays, educational components. So if you imagine that the first part where you were reaching out to the different species after the sort of white veil neutralized other senses, we're talking about the heart, the emotional attachment to the species. The upper level has to do with the intellect. It has to do with the head, where you have different systems that are playful, it's a break, but they also allow you to understand the mechanisms and the systems behind the biodome. And so there's no walls that hide what you see. The behind the scenes is revealed. And so you have this heart, as I was saying, with the species, and trying to see, can we perhaps change people? These were prototypes. And as people leave, this sentence that is striking, how human beings and nature are sort of on this collision course. And then after that follows by different examples of what people can do. So the Biodome had a great influence on the firm. I think it deepened even more a commitment towards this balance between human and species. I mean, at the time, it was a younger firm. To be able to have the privilege and honor of working in such an important institution and winning such a substantial mandate for a public museum was enormous. And the feat and the task was a true collective effort that has created a project that's published around the world presently. Imago is another project with which we had fun. This was during the Biodome. This is in between architecture and art, and it's not built. The city of Montreal, like so many cities around the world, needed to go through infrastructure repairs. That means streets were going to be opened up, and all of the commercial spaces and residents were going to be bothered. And so they used this opportunity to create a competition and to see, can we create something that follows construction work on the street, but at the same time becomes an icon, is emblematic and functional. And so we consider the street, again, as a living entity that's continuously evolving, a living city. And within this living city, we started studying what is called an imago. Imago is actually the final stage of development, adult stage of an insect. And trying to see, can we have something that moves along and follows the city as it grows? And we use these wing patterns that are highly efficient of the butterfly, for example, to be able to start creating an inflatable structure, a structure that you can inflate in minutes, deflate in minutes, that can adapt in different openings and widths and start becoming a way to occupy the street. Imago became a sense of visual identity. It spoke of the sun, of the clouds, of hope. It won the competition and it was selected to be built. These are different images that circulated to imagine, can you, and this was negotiations with firemen, with police, with the city, everything. The type of material, the textile. And you're seeing again, we had never tried an inflatable structure. We started today, we were looking at perforated aluminum, metal. There was photo engraving in concrete. There's architectural textile. It seems every time we have this ambition, perhaps poor reflex of always trying something new every time, but not for the purpose of something new, for the raison d'être of the project. And so this was the idea that Imago was going to shine and become a way to solve that problem. And then to perhaps start having it move across the city and perhaps be a tool for also people to remind them what was happening in the downtown. Outside skating rinks. Due to different reasons that had to do more with municipal and political life, right before construction, the project was abandoned. But for some reason, we believe it will come back in a different shape and size. So those were bigger, more important projects that had affected us. And maybe now, just before ending, I'll just go through a few projects of where we are at now. And this is maybe where I'm sharing you more things that are unbuilt, but they're part of our everyday work. In 2017, we had been the recipients of what we call the Prix de Rome in architecture. And our proposal was entitled Adaptive Boundaries. And it was the idea that by traveling and meeting different experts, architects, research-based studies, can we start diluting the boundaries around the building? And in the sense, can buildings start becoming a way to cohabitate with species? And from that study of a few years, we created 26 questions. And these 26 questions started to take the shape and size of an exhibition. And so now it's planned to be opened in April. And it's actually our office space using those words from that research, those sentences, to create an exhibition called Cohabitats, which asks people questions and perhaps to start thinking of our relationship to nature and perhaps start being simply a bully with regards to other species. This is called the Nest House. This is a direct result of this research. We actually should be going for tender for construction, if everything goes well, within 48 hours. This is built outside of the city in a gorgeous area, but where the skin of the building, there is a second skin to it, is a space for growing both vegetation and different bird houses. And so the walls themselves becomes an opportunity, a space to be able to cohabitate with other species. And it's based on the notion that within all this is a courtyard. And finally, we are, and it should be ending soon, we are presently, one of our latest work called Traces is at representing Canada, the Canada Pavilion in Dubai at the World Expo. Traces is a series of boxes where we have actually fossilized birds. And the idea is that if there is such a transformation of habitats, of environments, and such a rapid breakdown of these habitats, then there's such a rapid disappearance of species. But it's going at a rhythm and accelerating so quickly that artistically the interpretation is, could you for a moment imagine that we fossilize a flock of birds in midair? And fossils, this emblematic of extinction, and birds that have no frontiers, that belong to all country, the notion of freedom, that freedom is extinct, that the birds are fossilized in a moment. And as they're fossilized, we then created these cubes, these amber cubes, where each one, there's 8 of them, tell a different story. Some of them are thrown on the floor as the notion of forgotten, for that is sometimes what we do with living species. Some of them are placed on a pedestal to be celebrated as jewels of the past. And so there was these 8 boxes that were created. The nearness, a gigantic monument that you're close to. The memorial where we actually placed it as almost like a tomb, and you pay tribute to a species that's disappeared, the forgotten, thrown on the floor. The seat is in one-on-one. You open an old school desk, and within it, and there's a bird, and it's fascinating, the birds, because the birds were sculpted and then scanned and then animated on the computers. And then we isolated different positions and then 3D printed hundreds of these birds to then be placed into molds before pouring a medium of amber. The gathering, which is around the table, collective. The sanctuary where nobody can go in. And is it either a prison for birds or a notion of rewilding, where perhaps the best way to protect the environment is at times to not allow humans to go everywhere. And the awareness where 4 people are placed together. And so this is a traveling exhibition. It's starting right now, ending in Dubai, and for 4 to 5 years, it should be traveling the world. And the idea can, these traces, these boxes, once again, if I come back to the heart, the compelling, attaching object, the head, the intellect, the story, the disappearance of the species, and the hand, can this promote change, both collectively and individually. So this is for you, Pinar. This is when we met as co-jury together at the World Architecture Festival in 2019. So I will stop sharing, if you don't mind. That covers a little of what we call the storytelling, Biodome, and other manners, and story of Canva, of the team, and what shaped us and what we're working on. So
thank you very much. I think you've done it wonderfully. I really want to congratulate you and your team of Canva for creating such beautiful, such successful sensory spaces, spaces that has great respect to nature, and also places, not spaces, but places that just reflect the story of the region, of the geography. It's I think combining all these things together is a hard job. I really congratulate you
Thank you.
On behalf of my university, and also thank you for sharing all these things to us. I have a very little note for the audience. If they have questions, they can write it in the chat section of this Zoom.
Okay.
So they may have. Today, we had a studio session at school, and we do it via Zoom again. But some of our students, maybe because they knew that that you were our guest, they presented your nest house. That's a very nice coincidence, I think. Thank you very much also explaining it such a nicely way. I wonder your teamwork. I think your team consists, the Canva team consists lots of architects. Only architects or some other professions also included? Just like artists, just like
no,
writers.
it's almost only architects.
Only architects.
We have Louise, which actually incredible. Not only she handling all the administration of the office, but she was actually in textile engineering before. And Killian, who's in charge of all the sites, who also has a very technical engineering approach. But a lot of the things come from within, whether they're texts or art and all that. But we also work a lot with collaborators. There is no way that a team that is so small can generate so many projects. So, I mean, when I'm looking at traces, there's a multimedia artist called Etienne who was on the team with us. We had Khalifa, who was doing the sculptures of the birds. People were taking care of sounds. There's a lot of teams that gather around Canva. And we actually usually do that right from the start. So you see, we've been mandated recently for just something which is just enjoyable on the side of a pedestrian street. And the first reflex is right away, okay, let's go get architectural historian. Let's learn about the history of pedestrian streets within the Montreal context. And maybe we'd like to go and study a maker of pavers. So the pavers that were placed on the street before everybody used asphalt and concrete, can we work with that person? So it's a reflex in the office to combine with other disciplines. Okay, thank you. And what about when you are sharing your ideas with others? Do you have any difficulty in expressing what you want or what they can offer to you? Do you have any some dialogues? I mean, when you are improving some dialogues, do you also develop your own ideas? I mean, is it your own idea that you impose them? Please do this for us, or you negotiate them and you develop these ideas when you are collaborating with them? When how this is arranged? No, it's a very good question. I think that the essence of a project, the story of it, the first lines of a project are generated here within the team. Okay. But the means of expression of that change. And that's when you need to allow the collaborators to teach you. And you're I mean, we didn't know how to bring concrete to life. We just said that we wanted the building to be part of the street, to be didactic. And so we're actually very close to suppliers and different construction experts. And we usually call them very early during the projects and ask them, what do they think? What's doable? What can we put forward? And I mean, it's become almost a joke now. They know that when they're going to receive a call from us, it's going to be something, again, it's going to have to be very complicated or creative or different, but we get them involved right away. I think that's one thing about the collaboration. The other thing is, of course, to respect everybody's expertise and to understand that you can't be good at everything at all. But there's also the idea of, and I used to joke about this many, many years ago, to know if something was powerful, is to be able to explain the idea to a non-architect without images, simply on a 1 minute to 2 minute conversation by phone. If you can do that, and if you can reach the essence of a project as simply as that, and the other person feels an emotion on the other side of the line, then the story already has so much value. If you need 700 drawings and graphics and tools to never always keep going and explain, then you have not reached an idea, you're in the process of an idea. And it's not the time to freeze it. And to know when to stop the evolution of an idea is very hard to teach. To understand when is the moment where it's just enough to be able to be strong and to receive 40% of modifications and still stand as the idea. And when also it's not developed too much that it allows other people to contribute. That moment in creativity is very hard to identify and to capture.
Okay. But what about your process in the office when other collaborators are left out or you haven't met them yet, but you are generating ideas? So do you have thinking or applying order? I mean, do you start with sketches? Do you start with sounds? Do you start with only the story of the place? I mean, how do you put things in order to create an idea? Or is it always changing?
I think that we've tried so many years, we wanted to be able to create some sort of efficient methodology that can be followed, so you don't wake up every morning and re-question your life all the time. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And so sometimes it's going to be, like you say, understanding a site, going through the history of a site. Sometimes you're going to go and walk and feel that there's more wind. Sometimes you're going to see what's next to you. Sometimes you're going to see what species is there. Sometimes you have a feeling and you're going to go and get 3 or 4 books from the library, from history to poetry, and you're going to read them. I don't think there's one way. And what we like to do is to do several explorations at the same time on the same project. Because life is funny, but there's sometimes overlaps that start to appear. I mean, can you imagine that we would have thought cinema would have revealed the movie of a fire of horses 2 blocks away from our site? I don't think that's an imaginable thing in a linear process. I think the idea of not being linear helps. I mean, there is a constraint in time and pressure and fees. We're in a reality that also has to do with money. So you can't just think about it forever. But you start developing these tools and you explore all of them simultaneously. And there's as many sketches as words as I think discussing is enormous. Exchanging, being able to share within the team. It's not just one person that has a genius pen and draws and that's it. This whole notion of the glorified instinct of the architect that creates and hands over so that the vision becomes real. I don't believe in that. I believe that you're greater when you exchange and communicate with others, and you're greater when you're sensitive enough to be able to see a site beyond just its geometry and scale.
Okay. What about competitions? What do you think about them? I see that you have participated to more than 40 competitions, or you have more than 40 awards, nearly 40 competitions you did. Why is the number is so high? You love being in them, or is that how work comes to you? So what's your relation with competitions?
Well, there's one of them is pragmatic in the sense that important public mandates or public mandates in Quebec and the city of Montreal are obliged to go through competitions.
Good.
You cannot have a school without a competition. So that means that there's a lot of these competitions. We enjoy it. I think you feel like you're in school, you're back to a studio, it's long, long hours, there's very dynamic, a lot of energy. I think I had a very hard time with them a few years ago because we kept losing. At one point, we were just losing so many in a row that you start questioning yourself. And then I think that if you use the competition as a means to better understand and improve your practice and not just to win, then it becomes a much more valuable tool. But competitions are tricky, Pinar, because they also have to do with the capacity to communicate more than content at times. This is a big dilemma. It becomes a branding exercise. It becomes a commercialization. And sometimes the more beautiful image will win, even if it's not necessarily feasible, even if it's not buildable. And I think competitions have reacted to this because the juries are becoming more and more technical. And so you can't just show up and just say, oh, I like this image versus another one. It's a very analytical process. But still, there's a lot of marketing into it in the sense of sales. And so you have to be able to have that line. I think that when we get into final stages of competitions, whether it's public presentations or final drawing, I think we're very comfortable at those levels. Because our projects tend to have stories, we tend to communicate a lot. So we have an enormous amount of practice in terms of either oral or graphics and all that to communicate ideas. But earlier stages of competitions, when you're just submitting one board, I used to get a big thrill out of it because when it was anonymous, we would enjoy so greatly participating or competing against the bigger, older firms. There was something about it very, like this sort of teenage rebellion. Now we do a bit less. I'd have to tell you that we won't do more than maybe 3 or 4 per year. It calms down. And logistically, I cannot hide to you that it's an enormous amount of fees. It's an investment. And for a smaller firm, you can't just keep doing it and keep losing it. At one point, it makes no sense. But it's important in our practice because it offers all sorts of thinking.
So do you think that you can use all your abilities, all your experience with the things, with senses you are doing in architecture in the competitions as well?
No, because this is a problem. Because the panel you submit is a 2D. So if I want to speak to you about heat and smell and touch, how do you want me to do this on a panel? We have a lot of discussions about representation of architecture, architectural representation. I value prototypes for that reason. For prototypes are an experience rather than just a visualization. And so oddly enough, what allows to put forward a more sentient or sensorial experience is words.
Okay.
And you come back. We've accompanied competitions not with texts, with poems that we've created. And you come back to words to make people live an emotion. And it's really extraordinary to imagine that with all the tools available, digital, commercial, all the software, there is still a reflex that words have such an important value in describing an architectural project.
So it means that as architects, you need to be like a Renaissance man who has ability in reading, writing, in painting, in sculpturing, in everything. You have to feed yourself with many things in order to have good communication with other people.
you have to have those skills.
Mm-hmm.
They don't all have to come from the same human.
Mm-hmm.
Canva is an entity that everybody has different talents. I mean,
yeah.
On a personal level, I can paint, I can draw, I can write, I can do words. If you ask me to do anything on a software, I'm completely useless.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, but I think it is necessary, and I think it's valued also. I think that's what's encouraging about competitions.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, in many parts of the world, it's still that spectacular one shot, one 3D that just wins. But I don't think it's about that anymore. I think meaning is so important. And I hope architecture, the practice itself, goes towards being meaningful. And the meaningful belongs to everyone.
Yeah.
Your meaning doesn't have to be my meaning. That doesn't matter. As long as your meaning respects my meanings, that we're not hindering other meanings, then architecture makes sense. Perhaps I am a big critical of the notions of form and function. I believe we're beyond form and function. I respect the principle of form and function. I believe in the value of light, of proportions, and so forth. But there's also something else. And with materials ever changing, with social structures changing, the way we experience buildings, there's a lot of room for architecture to redefine itself right now. And it must also be a social actor. It must.
Okay. What about the prizes and your fees that you earn in as office? Are you satisfied with the
fees?
With the money you earn? Because you put a lot of energy, a lot of emotion, a lot of work to make it run. But are you satisfied with what you get? I mean, it's not only the building, it's not only seeing the building built, and it's not about only people using a building and they are happy there. But what about the money part? Are you happy with that too?
Tudor and I established a practice which is quite different in terms of money.
Mm-hmm.
This is a long story, but I'll try and make it short.
Okay.
We do not have only a traditional architecture practice. We developed at the same time a firm that for many years was a construction firm. We were building things. And we also had another firm that had to do with managing of buildings. And so the only building that ever went through all of these stages is the University Edison residence, where we were the architects, but we were also the people building it and the owners that managed this university residence. And it has good and bad sides. I mean, it has bad sides because when the university residence opened, we thought we were the only ones that had noticed there was a niche. But I think 6, 7 hotels became university residents. So instead of being in the office drawing projects, we were out with flyers trying to get students to rent the room. So you wear different hats, and by building them, it's a big liability if it doesn't go well, financial risks and so forth. But at the same time, it means that the team that's drawing in the office is also the one that was on site building it.
Okay.
So you can imagine when I tell you that the storytelling combined with this technical innovation of people that know how to build, we're not considered dreamers. Usually when we approach trades, they say, it's okay, Canva's going to figure out a way to actually build it. So let's work with them. I'll just close the window now, sorry.
Okay.
So that has allowed us to generate other forms of revenues. Because indeed, architecturally, it can be a challenge if you decide to dedicate so much more time to the development of a project, so much more innovation. It's not the same level of efficiency as simply executing readily a project. It'll take 2-3 times more. 2, 3 more times in terms of labor costs and schedule. So, and then that doesn't mean that you're going to get paid for that additional time. So there is a balance to be had there. I mean, you can play with this. I'll give you an example, which is always interesting. So I'll come back to Edison again. University residence that's addressed to international students. Because students from Montreal don't go in university residence, they live in Montreal. So we spoke with the whole financial team and we said, well, what's the budget that you have to promote and do publicity around cities in the world? You probably 100, 200, 300. You have a big budget because publishing around the world is very costly.
Yeah.
We said, put all of this budget into the facade because the building will be published around the world. You'll have free publicity. Use the architecture as the vehicle to promote your project. Don't do a cheap project and just pay on the image of the project across the sea. And everybody agreed to it. And once it got built and these photos of the concrete, the firemen appearing and they're in the windows and the sun comes and it appears inside, it was published around the world and students would be saying, this is where I want to live. This interests me. This place has a story. When I say people where I live, I can tell the story of where I live. So after 1 year, the place has been filled every year, fully booked. And I believe it's the architecture that became the tool to secure financial success. So because we play in a world where the firm also is in management and construction, the understanding of numbers is fundamental in a practice. You need to understand business, economy, rates, and so forth. So I spoke to you for now about poems and being sensitive and human in nature, but behind this is a very strong business approach to stay alive and to succeed, not just stay alive.
Okay, thank you very much. There are some questions from the audience as well, not only from me. Dear professors, this is the first time I read the question. Okay. Thank you for this talk, full of creative ideas. I am not an expert in architecture, just a layperson when it comes to talking about buildings and architecture. However, I see that we have so very few spaces or buildings that tell a story in Turkey. In addition, Rami Bebawi has emphasized putting in your heart in design, but most buildings, especially government buildings in Turkey, seems to be soulless. What can be the reason for this? I don't know for whom this question is, for you or for me, because it is about the Turkish situation. Maybe we can turn it in this way. How can we feel the soul of a building? Of course, it's architecture, the way the figures are put. But what else? I mean, is it the colors? Is it the roof? Is it how you move in it? There can be hundreds of things. But what are the main? Yes, what are the main things that comes to your mind when I say very well communicating and full of soul building?
Probably I'm going to come back, Pinar.
What would you fall in love in the building, in a building? Is it the eyes? Is it the hair? What is it?
At one point, there was a discussion at the office recently about what's the difference between scenography, theater, and architecture. And is architecture a series of moments? Is it a series of stages, of plays? Is that what we are finally? Like, we've used so many big words for so many years, and maybe we're just a series of moments. And if so, because the streets are a series of moments, and the way we build a memory if I ask you, what did you do today? You tend to tell the story in a series of moments. We actually remember things in such a way. And so maybe an architecture with a soul is an architecture that puts forward a series of moments. And I know it's a very broad answer, but I'm personally still thinking of this notion. The biodome, this skin, this gigantic skin, which is like 2-3 floors high, as I was saying, 0.5 kilometer long, was a series of moments. I mean, when it pressed you and decompressed you and opened and it was slit, but every moment was stopped, framed like a theater, comme une pièce de théâtre. And in that moment, how do we control the light? What do we reveal? What do we do this? What do you feel? And how long do you stay in each moment? Now, this is an important notion because public architecture has to do with flow. Mm-hmm. How much time you take to go from point A to point Z, this notion of flow, so time and distance, has an impact on the moments you're creating, the sequence of moments, right? Cinema has an advantage on us. They put you on a seat and you're stuck 2 hours in that place. Mm-hmm. So they can play with you. Architecture, we don't have that. We're going to move you around all the time. Okay? Yes. And you don't see what I see and I don't feel what you feel. So, and I did understand flow before doing the museum. When we were in the second stage of the competition, the Biodome in 2014, we were very young and we're just surrounded by architects from around the world, finalists. And then one of them starts asking this question about flow. And I'm looking and I don't know what the hell they're talking about. And I said, why are we talking about flow? I want to know what's the space, the square footage and all that. And this person is starting to educate me because you realize that people that are very successful don't compete anymore. They're there about being generous. They share. Huh? And it's true. And so he was explaining to me flow. And so 10 years or 8 years later, I'm trying to think now, well, am I just flowing through moments or scenes? So it's a very different way of saying architecture. I'm not sure if it's correct, but I think it would be a way to address the notion of a soul, which was in the question.
Okay, thank you. There is another question from a student, I suppose. When you're doing your teamwork, how do you find a common ground when you have disagreements in the team? Do you fight? Or you just order something to each other? Or how do you come to a conclusion when you have very different and diverse ideas in the team?
Well, firstly, I can talk about Tudor and myself, the two co-founders. We almost always start the project disagreeing.
Oh.
Like, it's fundamental. Everybody knows you're going to step into the room and one's going to see something and the other one's going to see something else. And we're very convinced about the way we see or understand things. Now, then the team arrives and all sorts of other options which make you question and debate and so forth. And I'm lucky because I can now look back on almost 20 years and I can tell you that the projects were successful because we kept disagreeing until we agreed. And I don't know how to say it, but disagreeing is not bad. I'm not scared anymore when the team disagrees. It's okay. We've been through that process where you think there is no other option. We're always going to disagree for the rest of our life. And finally, it's not that. You can actually, what you do is that you question the other, not on the proposal, but of why. And usually the why starts to look similar. Okay? It's the formal expression which is so different. And so if the why starts to become similar and communicating and talking and articulating your ideas and having the intellectual capacity to explain why I'm doing something. The hardest thing for me is when somebody proposes something and I ask why, and there's no answer, then we can't have a discussion.
Okay.
If there is no why, then okay, then there's 15 million good solutions, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you tell me that you want somebody to enter the building because you're doing a museum that has to do with objects made of iron, and iron comes from the ground, and you need to perhaps dig within the ground and reveal the foundation walls to generate the entrance of a museum, then I understand why you're showing me the foundations.
Mm-hmm.
This was a debate this morning. So
okay, I've got it.
yeah.
And there is a question from a young graduate. What are your suggestions to young architects? If you had just graduates, what would you do or not do?
I feel already old when you ask me the question. It's funny, when I graduated, one of my professors was trying to convince me to find an architect that I admired and to go sit at their footsteps, entrance, and offer my services to sharpen pencils or anything they wanted, to be able to learn from somebody you admire. Unfortunately, I never chose that. And Tudor and I spend most of our time learning it alone. Mm-hmm. We didn't have mentors. We actually don't really have mentors. We learned everything alone. It's a great school, but it's long and it's hard. And I think that
really?
maybe...
Didn't you have any role models or...
Well, there was architects that I admired, but to say that there was mentors within the community or around us or in the city or people we can follow, no, we were always on our own. And so I would say that that's not the best way to do it.
So you don't have the stars in your school? Star architects in your school, or no other star architects around?
Not that we consider star architects, but yes, there are some that are very recognized. But okay. we have different ways of doing things. But there is no true mentor. And I think that finding mentorship is really useful at a young age in terms of career. If I had advice, it would also be regarding technology and software. I know that we ask of graduates to be so good at rendering 3D and Revit and grasshopping and scripting and all that, but take the time to learn to think. I can't preach sufficiently how thinking and communicating is so important. I think that's what has to be practiced the most. There's a few advices I could give, but I would of course say work hard, but that makes me sound like I'm 150 years old, but
sure.
I would say to be committed to your practice. It takes so much to even reach a sense of comfort. It must have taken Tudor and I 10, 12, 15 years to actually be comfortable at using the word architecture and saying that we practice architecture. So there's a lot of patience, maybe the mentorship, thinking, communicating. Yeah, I would also say take the time to walk. It sounds very silly. Don't Google everything. Don't Google Earth everything. Don't search everything on your phone or your computer. Take the time to walk, to understand the city. Architects have a responsibility not just to buildings, but to cities. And maybe just putting aside all of technology and iWatches and phones and all this, and just walking a city and thinking about the city, being critical, having a critical thought process. Critical, not negative. Critical as in, I understand my city. I look at heights, at volumes, at spaces, Why is it that when places are compressed, people walk faster? Why is it that when they will open up, people take their time? Why is it that we gather in this way rather than this way? At the end of the day, we're just housing human experience. So I think we need to observe it a bit more.
Okay. What about the reactions to your buildings? I mean, what did you hear from your from the people who occupy the building, who use the building, who live in the building, and also who visit the building?
For the people that just see the building, that it's the panoply of opinions is spectacular, and that's okay. I think you learn at one point to detach yourself. I mean, Irene, that won the Award of Excellence of Canada in Innovation with the curtain mesh, was considered online and searched in social media to be, I think, a car deposit or something like that. So it's okay. There's different opinions everywhere. I think the most important is the opinion of the neighbors and the occupants.
Okay.
And we've had the privilege of going back to many buildings that we've designed. Not enough. I think it would have, we don't take the time, I think, sufficiently to do a post-mortem of projects. We do it in terms of finance and construction and all that, but it would be more important to do a post-mortem of the experiences. And then to bring in people that have occupied them to understand. I mean, most of them have been very successful. I'm humbled by the comment. I mean, the Biodome reaction has been extraordinary, and from some very monumental compliments to kids 6, 7 years old that they receive a note from their parents saying, thank you for allowing us to travel within the clouds.
Wow.
Because that's what the white skin was for them. So there's all sorts of feedback, but now that you mention it, I think it's important for us to go more into it. You see, it's easier with art installations because the art installations get immediate response, and you know right away, because if it's exhibited for 4 months and there's nobody that goes there, you understand that you failed. It's direct, right? I mean, so that's easy to receive good feedback, bad feedback. I mean, we've had some works which have been very provocative, very well received, whereas some more conservative that were just a catastrophe. I should show you a series of all the projects that went bad or the competitions that went bad. They also occur. But generally, our projects are well received, and it's good to build confidence and to learn lessons.
Okay, this is what I guessed, and I wanted you to explain it. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Rami. It was a great joy for us to host you, to interview with you, and also listening to your presentation was very nice. I've searched your website just before we met. I think your writing in your website is okay, but when you want to start to explain things, it is much more different. It sounded to me and it looked to me. I mean, your explanations are much more making it understood by the other side. I mean, text is a text. It's okay. It's a cold one. But once you start to talk about it, explain it more, I got the feeling that you wanted to raise. I mean, I understand your targets really. Not from your writings on your website, but from your speech and from your images you introduced. I think this is the value of organizing such kind of interviews and making it, presenting it as videos to the society. And I'm very happy to be doing it with you. Thanks a lot for giving us this chance too. Otherwise, we would just know what Canva architecture was doing only from websites and some films, very short films that you have, I've seen. But you made everything clear for us. Thank you.
You're very kind. You know, it was well. First, it's great to see you. It's a great pleasure to share it. But I want to add something to what you're saying, because it's so true. What you're saying about being able to explain a project in person or on the screen, wherever. And we realized that over the years, we give the presentation of our projects to the construction teams before they start building. And many have asked us, why are you doing this? They're following the tender documents. They have to pour concrete. They know how many steel to put in it. They have to do this. And we asked to have half an hour with the trades to explain why they're building what they're building. And beyond the website, because we know they look at the web, and communicating the why of you do something, the raison d'être, brings a whole different dimension to building, in the sense that you're respecting them to the point where you need them to understand why they do. They're not just objects in a sort of system.
Yes.
And it gives them value that when they're going to ask themselves a question, I already told people a project which lasts 3 to 4 years, expect on average 2,000-3,000 questions per year about the project of shall I do this, shall I do that, and on 5 years, that's 15,000 questions. If nobody has the same story, the project is going to become anything. You make sure that the story is shared with everybody. And so when the person going to do the form work has to take a minor decision, which is the corner to be poured like inside or outside, then they can remember, this person wants me to reveal this story, which detail expresses it the best.
Good.
So human communication, greater than websites, like you say, but is still so important in our practice. Yes. So it's for me to thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. It was very nice to talk about stories, their place in our life, their place in architecture, how architecture can be part of story. I think it was very interesting topic. Thank you very much for this, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. I think we got the most of it. I'm really happy. And of course, we can talk hours and hours, and talking with you hours and hours is very enjoyable. But maybe another time we can organize something else. I'm sure our students have a lot to learn from you too. Thank you very much for devoting so much time. Thank you. Thanks a lot. So good evening, everybody. Thank you.